Depression. It's not my favourite emotion, and it's very much like being a marble in a bowl. No matter how much momentum you make to try and escape the bowl, you always find yourself falling back into the familiar feeling of numbness. And it's very much like being tuned into the 6 o'clock news 24/7. So, how can we conquer depression? Can we conquer depression? Well, yes, otherwise I wouldn't have made this video. But anyway, there are only two things you need to do to conquer your depression. Number one, we need to understand what the bloody hell is happening upstairs when we're depressed. And number two, we need to spiral upwards. Because here's the thing, we cannot change where you're at, but we can change where you're going. So regardless of whether you're clinically diagnosed or you're just going through a rough patch in your life, let's conquer this bloody thing. So, oh no. Now I have to draw. Getting into the understanding of things, let's address the bad news first. When it comes to depression, we don't really know what it is in the same way that we know what Alzheimer's or Parkinson's is, and we can only see the symptoms, and the causes are many for depression. And the last piece of bad/good news is there's no fundamental difference between a depressed and a non-depressed brain. Now, the reason you feel depressed is because if we imagine this is the brain, I'm going to oversimplify neuroscience, but screw it, we ball. In our brains, we have many different circuits for many different things. For example, we have a decision-making circuit, a stress management circuit, memory, pain, thinking and feeling. And when you're depressed, your circuits are a bit out of whack, which means that they're not functioning properly. But most importantly, when we feel depressed, there is a bit of a miscommunication between our thinking and our feeling circuits. For all of you aficionados out there, our thinking circuit would be this part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, and your feeling is your limbic system. So it's a bit further back in your brain. And these two brain regions are always communicating. But as mentioned, when we're depressed, this communication is disrupted for whatever reason. So spiraling upwards largely involves improving the communication between these two brain regions. There's an important thing to note with depression, and that is when you're depressed, there's nothing fundamentally wrong about your brain. Just to give you an analogy to illustrate this, why do tornadoes happen in Oklahoma and not New York City? They happen in Oklahoma because the conditions for a tornado to happen are better in Oklahoma and not New York City. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with Oklahoma. It just means the conditions are better primed for a tornado to happen. So there's nothing wrong with your brain, it's just your circuits are a bit out of whack. But the good news is, as we mentioned a few moments ago, we cannot change where you're at, but we can change where you're going. Which is to say, when we make small changes, we rewire our brain and we strengthen certain circuits which help us spiral upwards, which we're going to get into in a few minutes' time. Now, moving into the next part, there's just a few more things we need to understand about neuroscience which will help us spiral upwards, and they're actually quite simple. He realises, as he now sees he has to draw a bloody neuron. Right, okay, let's split up and reconvene after I draw this masterpiece. Bollocks. Apologies for triggering your trauma of potentially very boring science lessons when you were younger, but there was no other way for me to explain this. The neuron. The neuron. You might have heard of these little fellas before. There are 86 billion of them in your brain, apparently, and they are essentially your brain's computing power. So everything we think, feel, and do at any given moment in time is a result of these little fellas firing and wiring together. You watching this video now, you're just a bundle of neurons fixed on a screen, as am I in front of a whiteboard. But anyway, these neurons talk to each other in our brain, and the way they do so is they fire electrochemical signals, so pulses of electricity, along a very long branch, very much like an electrical cable in real life. Now, when this electrochemical signal reaches the end of a branch, the neuron squirts out this little message. It's not a voice note or a selfie, it's called a neurochemical, so it can attach onto another neuron so they can fire together. But the important thing to note is these neurochemical signals that each neuron sends to each other are not commands for our behaviour, they're votes. Which is to say, it's very much like a presidential election. If enough neurons send the same message to other neurons, then that behaviour that message wants us to do will be performed. or with enough votes, that behaviour wins the election. So remember what we said earlier, in the sense that when you're depressed, your circuits are just operating a bit out of whack. Well, the important thing to note is when we change the way our neurons fire and wire together, we change the way our brain is structured, and we also change our behaviour and how we think and feel. Because remember, how we think, feel and behave at any given moment in time is a consequence of how our neurons fire and wire together. If you're looking at all of this thinking, oh, this is a bit complicated and a bit disorganized in our brain, considering there's 86 billion of these little fellas up here, don't worry. They're all organized neatly into little brain regions up here. Moment of silence for the neuron before we move on. Now, hopefully after covering that information, you're a little bit more curious as to what these things called neurochemicals or neurotransmitters are. Now, neurochemicals released in our brain work very much like a flight network. You know when you go to an airport and you see that big screen in front of you to check what time your flight is and what gate number you need to go to? It's the same with these. When they're released in our brain, remember between that gap between two neurons called a synapse, we jump on them and they determine how we feel, what we think, and what we do, and they all serve a different function. For example, serotonin promotes willpower, motivation, mood. Norepinephrine is involved when we're thinking, focusing, or managing our stress. Dopamine is involved in the pursuit, emphasis, pursuit of reward. Oxytocin, trust, love, connection, reducing anxiety. GABA, when we feel relaxed and also reducing anxiety. Melatonin enhances our quality of sleep, and two more, endorphins, usually what we feel after a good workout, help us with pain relief and enjoyment. And lastly, endocannabinoids improve our appetite, feelings of peacefulness and well-being. All pretty positive stuff, right? Well, when we're depressed, we experience the complete opposite of what all of these neurochemicals provide. For example, low mood, overthinking, inability to focus, no motivation, no feeling of connection and high anxiety, no ability to relax, poor quality of sleep, intense feelings of pain, lack of enjoyment, and a diminished or over-heightened appetite, and no feelings of well-being or peacefulness. So you might be thinking, well, Lewis, let's just increase the levels of these neurochemicals in our brain. It's not necessarily about increasing our levels of these neurochemicals when we're depressed, but again, remember, it's about rewiring the tuning of our circuits. Ladies and gentlemen, we have almost finished the understanding section, and we are so close to covering the few practical ways we can spiral upwards out of depression. But before we do so, there's just one tiny little thing more I want to explain about the brain. That is, we're just going to cover the few brain regions you need to know about when it comes to depression. Remember at the beginning of the video when we said that largely when you're depressed, it's due to a miscommunication between this front part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, and an older part of your brain called the limbic system. Well, the technical term for it is the frontal limbic system. So now let's quickly cover all of the brain regions involved in this system and see what their functions are. First up, we have the prefrontal cortex. Some of you might have heard of this part of the brain before. It's known as the CEO of your brain because it is involved in thinking, decision making, planning, all of that good stuff. But it just so happens when we're depressed, it goes into overdrive and is responsible for us feeling worry, guilt, shame, or being indecisive. It's also comprised of a few key areas in the brain which govern our ability to focus inwardly, externally focus, and it also has a thinking and feeling part. And what you'll notice as we briefly cover these brain regions is they all have benefits and drawbacks, in the sense that when we're depressed, we largely experience the drawback. Now moving on to the feeling part of our brain, so the limbic system. Good jawline. Not sure about the eyes though. Second to last, the limbic system. Now we're mainly going to single in on four key regions of this brain. We've got the hippocampus, and this is the part of your brain which is responsible for saving your long-term memory. If you think about when you're on a computer, you're writing a document and you press save, that is what this brain region does. Its neurons, however, are very sensitive to stress. It engages in something called context-dependent memory. So when you're feeling depressed, because you're in the context of feeling depressed, you mainly have negative memories of misery, sadness, and doom and gloom. To illustrate this, let's imagine your primary school, or your, what would you call it in America? I'm not sure, but your grade school. And you might not have a good memory of what the school looked like right now. But if I was to take you to the school campus tomorrow, you would be flooded with old memories you didn't have access to just sitting in your house, because you're in the context of that memory. So that's a little insight as to why your brain only gives you depressing memories when you feel depressed. Up next is the amygdala. In Latin, it translates to almond because it looks like a little almond in your brain. This is what governs fear, anxiety, and some other emotions. Two more, the hypothalamus controls stress. And lastly, we have the anterior cingulate, which is responsible for your focus and your attention. It's much like a computer screen in the sense that what you see on your screen determines what you click on. As the saying goes, where your attention goes, energy flows. And lastly, the final two brain regions we're going to cover. Whoa. Dude, what is that? This is not happening. Round 3. I think it's the angle at which I'm drawing it. Third to last, we have the dorsal striatum, which is the part of your brain which is responsible for your habits. It's the part of your brain which just wants you to do what you've always done before. Second to last, we have the nucleus accumbens, which is responsible for reward. And finally, we have the insula. Interestingly enough, this is the part of your brain which is responsible for your awareness of your bodily pain, which means when you're depressed, your insula kind of goes into overdrive, meaning you're more aware of your bodily pain. That is one of the symptoms of depression. Right, now that is the understanding done. Before we move into the next section, the juicy details, I just want to preface it with one final point. Spiraling upwards involves finding the right upward spiral that works for you, which is to say, all of our brain circuits are unique and different. For example, you might feel lonely after spending an evening alone. However, planning an event to meet your friends stresses you out. So a middle ground, which works for your brain circuits between those two things, could be working in a cafe throughout the day to meet your social needs. Find the right upward spiral for you among the information we're going to cover right now. So enough of the science lesson, let's get into these practical tips to conquer depression. The first thing we're going to cover to help you spiral upwards out of depression is depression's close cousin, anxiety. But before we dive into anxiety, I just want to differentiate between what anxiety is and what worry is. Because when you're feeling depressed, you're going to experience some form of anxiety in one way or another. When we worry about something, we're thinking about the problem. When we feel anxious, we feel the problem. And remember what we said at the beginning of this video, that when you feel depressed, it's just because your circuits are a bit out of whack. Well, the same circuits that are responsible for bloody hell, that's what happens when you try and spell on the spot. Decisiveness and planning are responsible for anxiety and worry. Now let's dive deeper into what anxiety actually is, covering the ABCs of anxiety. The ABCs of anxiety are, first of all, alarm. So this is where you might recognise, my heartbeat is racing if you're in a social situation and you usually get a bit socially anxious, or you're having a confrontation with someone and you think, he's angry if someone is talking to you a certain way. This is largely mediated by 3 brain regions, so your amygdala, which signals fear, your hippocampus and the anterior cingulate, because remember, that's the part of your brain which determines where your attention goes. Second is an unconscious mechanism, and this is the belief that you produce in response to the alarm. So, I'm having a heart attack, or he's going to hurt me. Remember, unconscious. This belief just pops up. And lastly, we have the coping mechanism you perform to try and deal with your anxiety. For example, you freak out, or you exit the social situation because you feel too anxious. Now, the important thing to note with dealing with anxiety is largely you need to engage. Whoa! Brain. You need to engage your prefrontal cortex. Remember, this front part of your brain. Why didn't I just point there? No idea. Now, some of you guys might have watched the video we did the other day on how to manage your brain so it stops behaving badly, where we covered some similar topics. One of the things I mentioned, which by the way, if you watched that video, thank you very much. One of the things I mentioned is one of my favorite things I've learned recently about anxiety is that at the root of it, anxiety is largely indecision. So you can quell a lot of your anxiety by just making a decision in those moments when you're really indecisive. Because here's the thing, to quickly draw the prefrontal cortex again, Jesus Christ, I'm getting better every time I do it. Remember, the prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain which helps you make decisions and plan, higher level thinking. But when you're anxious, your prefrontal cortex is too bogged down by things that are irrelevant, like little worries about things and just little annoyances. So you can't use it for that higher level thinking until you calm your amygdala down, which is the part that sparks your anxiety. Now you can do so through using a few mantras of your own. One I use, which is very useful if I'm ever feeling anxious in whatever situation, is I ask myself, right, what's the plan? So I can kickstart the decision-making part of my brain. But another thing we learn from Stoicism, which is useful, is something called the locus of control. When you feel more control over your life and your decisions and actions, you feel less anxious and you experience less pain and worry. Now you can dissect situations you feel anxious about in 3 categories. Things you have no control over, things you have some control over, and things you have full control over. Let's take one example, okay? Let's imagine your anxiety has sparked in a social environment because you feel socially anxious. Let's dissect it. What are some things you have no control over? You have no control over what other people say, what other people think, or human nature in general. You do have some control, however, over whether people like you and the extent to which people find you pleasant. You don't have full control, but some control. But you do have full control over how much you listen to other people, who you choose to speak to, and your mindset that you go into this social interaction with. One little thing before we move into some killer ways you can combat anxiety is the reason why such mantras as this, what's the plan, works, is because it engages something similar to what's known as interrogative self-talk. A lot of people think the best way to increase your self-belief is to suddenly turn into a positivity junkie, look yourself in the mirror and say, you're beautiful, you're strong, you're loved by people, you're amazing. No, in order to engage the prefrontal cortex, the rational, planning, decisive part of your brain, you need to paradoxically question your ability to do things because it will help you highlight how you can do that thing better. What I mean by this is you ask yourself, if you're about to perform something, can I do it? Or can I make today a win? Or more specifically, can I spiral upwards today? Because by questioning your ability, your brain will then give you answers and solutions to help you achieve this goal. Can I spiral upwards today? Oh, what would I have to do to make that happen today? Take care of my mental health, prioritize action which steers me in the right direction of feeling better, for example. What's also important to combat anxiety is not only to make decisions, but to make plans when you're catastrophizing. Take this scenario as an example. You call your friend to reach out to them, but they don't call you back. So you conclude, he must not like me. Spark in your limbic system and the emotional centers in your brain, thus further fueling your anxiety. However, make a plan. My friend didn't call me back. Okay, I'll call him again in 3 days. When you make a plan, when you're feeling anxious, you calm your limbic system down that is freaking out by releasing norepinephrine in your brain, which helps you focus and make plans, allowing you to feel more in control. Okay, now we've covered a few interesting ways to combat anxiety, mainly make decisions and form a plan. Let's cover a few more ways you can combat it. Number 1, label the emotion. If you're a big fan of this channel, then you know I've mentioned this plenty of times before in terms of building healthy emotional regulation. There were fMRI studies which got people to sit down and look at photos of people expressing quite distressing emotions. And what they showed is when they looked at the photos of these emotions, the participants' amygdala reacted with the same emotion. However, when these people were then asked to label the emotion they saw on the photos, their amygdala calmed down because by labeling the emotion, they engaged their ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which calms down your amygdala. I'm going to put something on screen now for the next 5 seconds or so called the Wheel of Emotions. I would recommend you print this out. Just type in Wheel of Emotions on the internet and stick it on your wall for any moment when you're feeling a bit overly emotional. Now, as men, of course, we don't like to speak a lot about emotions, but lads, you don't have to do this in front of other people. Just when your emotions are going a bit haywire, just label it to yourself in your head. Second of all is mindfulness. I know you don't want someone else on the internet telling you to practice meditation, but guess what? If everyone says the same thing, it's probably true. Mindfulness is great because it calms your amygdala by increasing, again, the activity in your prefrontal cortex. The only thing to do when you're feeling anxious, if you have the opportunity to do so, is to meditate and govern your breath. two more in this sequence are, these two are fairly simple, so we'll quickly go through them. Number 3 is find the real problem. Let's imagine you've organised a family gathering around your house and you've put on a big spread, you've cooked loads of food, but you're feeling a heightened anxiety as to organising this event when usually you feel quite calm doing such things. Well, if you get to the root of your anxiety, you might realise that you feel anxious because your mum is incredibly critical and you fear her judgment. If you're feeling incredibly socially anxious, get to the root of why you feel so. Is it because you fear the judgment of other people, or because you had an experience when you were 10 that just sparks your anxiety into overdrive? And lastly, number 4, anxiety is your brain doing its job. So when you instill something called non-judgmental awareness, you're able to recognize that, oh, anxiety is a sign that I have a healthy brain that is doing its job to protect me. It's not working against you, although it feels that way. It's trying to protect you. It's just your job and the prefrontal cortex's job to calm your anxiety down. Now we're going to finalise this sequence of anxiety by covering how we can combat negative thoughts. Now, when you're feeling depressed, you don't need me to remind you that you notice your mistakes more. So what's going on when we have that negativity bias? Well, there's two brain regions that are talking to each other. Most importantly, the dorsal anterior cingulate, don't worry about these fancy names, is what is responsible for letting your prefrontal cortex know when we need to pay attention to something. And it's just trying to help you out. For example, let's say you're a student in an exam hall and you fall asleep during your exam. This part of your brain is what is responsible for giving you a tap on the shoulder to let you know the teacher's come in, wake up and act like you're working. It would say to the prefrontal cortex, hey, we need to pay attention to this, time to use more processing power. And the PFC would be like, oh, okay. But the tricky thing is, when we notice our mistakes through this brilliant brain region that is always trying to help us, we freak our amygdala out and it goes into emotional overdrive. However, pay attention to this. When we notice that we're noticing our mistakes, it calms our amygdala down, which is one of the roles of meditation. You become the observer to your emotions and you feel calmer when you meditate because you no longer associate with the overreactive emotional overdrive of the amygdala. You've probably started to notice a theme here with all of these brain regions, and largely what spiraling upwards involves is our prefrontal cortex calming down our amygdala. Now, we would be remiss if we didn't speak about bad memories and how to become more optimistic. So let's do that now. Another thing you don't need me to remind you about when you feel depressed is that you have a lot more bad memories than good. Now, there are two brain regions that are involved in storing our bad memories. Again, the familiar culprit, the amygdala and the hippocampus, because remember, the hippocampus is what presses save on our memories. And when something stressful happens, our amygdala freaks out and says, dude, store this now, you need to store this into long-term memory, to our hippocampus. And the hippocampus is like, damn son, I got you. You can imagine these two as like those friends who are just always freaking out and they're just throwing flames onto each other's fire. But this creates one annoying fallacy that because we feel depressed most of the time, they're the only memories we have to store. So it's hard to remember a time in your life when things weren't so bad because you're so rooted in your negativity bias, which is hard to snap out of. But we can snap out of it by doing two things. Yeah, two things. Damn, Zion, store this now. I'm happy with the brain drawing so far, but let's see if we can do some better ones. How to be more optimistic? Well, you need to modulate your serotonin and norepinephrine levels, but more importantly, imagine the potential of future events occurring. And number 2, imagine that positive future events will happen. Have things booked in your calendar that you can look forward to, because if you have nothing to look forward to, you won't be able to engage that front part of your brain, prefrontal cortex, to calm down your amygdala by looking into the future and thinking, not everything is so doom and gloom because we got this to look forward to, this holiday, this event, whatever it is you want to do. Moving on, that is the part about anxiety done. A little pro tip to also quell your anxiety is long hugs produce something called oxytocin, which reduces anxiety. Next part. Point number 2 is hábitos, habits. Now, I released a full habits guide a few weeks ago, but I'm not going to be that dude on the internet who's like, oh, you should go and watch my video, because time is short and I want to respect yours. So we're mainly going to circle in, bollocks. We're mainly going to circle in on bad habits, because while you're depressed, you've likely leaned into some coping mechanisms. No judgment here, whether it's binge eating, fapping, I don't care what it is, there's absolutely no judgment. I just want to highlight a few things to you. All bad habits are sparked by one thing: stress. So if you're able to deal with stress in a better way, all of your bad habits will disappear. Because what happens is we experience stress in one form or another, we try to resist the bad habit, which makes us feel more stressed, and then it makes our brain want the bad habit even more. And more importantly, when we feel the trigger of stress, it's actually a trigger to perform bad habits without intention. And the brain area that we covered earlier that is responsible for all of this is your striatum. And it would argue in any given scenario, dude, let's just do what we've done before, because it is the command center for all of your knee-jerk reactions. And the best way to govern this brain region is to treat it like a dog. Because imagine, if you leave a dog in a room with some cookies by itself, it's going to eat the cookies until we teach it to not eat the cookies. So through repetition, we encode new behaviors into the striatum. But it would be pointless to talk about habit formation without mentioning the one buzzword that is rife on the internet today: willpower. The only thing you need to know about willpower is it is a finite resource, because it relies on one thing: how much serotonin is in the prefrontal cortex and how awake the prefrontal cortex is. And we don't have an infinite amount of serotonin to enact willpower all of the time. So if we can encode the behaviors we want into our striatum, they will become second nature. And in case you haven't noticed it, one thing that comes with the word finite is the word slip-ups. When you try to set new habits, you're gonna mess up. But as the Dutch say, fail and fail and fail, but less and less and less. So now you might be thinking, Lewis, if serotonin is responsible for our willpower in the prefrontal cortex, how can we increase our serotonin levels? Well, there are 4 things you can do. Get adequate sunlight, get massages frequently, or use something called a foam roller to do a low-cost way of getting your massages in. Number 3, exercise, which we're going to get into next. And remember, happy memories. And there's 2 more things in the context of habit formation that we're going to cover that will be beneficial for you to know. Make short-term sacrifices more rewarding through goal setting. We're going to get into goal setting in 2 points' time. But the important thing to note is that when we experience a slip-up, for example, we engage in a bad habit that we have highlighted contradicts a goal that we've set, our prefrontal cortex now needs to sit with that mistake and dissect, okay, what went wrong so we can prevent this for next time. Now, the best analogy I can give you for habit formation is treat yourself like a puppy. I know that sounds weird, but if you shout at a puppy after it slips up, it will wet itself and be too scared to even look you in the eyes. However, if you slowly guide it through understanding it's gonna slip up, but helping it prevent further slip-ups in the future, then it will work with you. This sequence as well of making short-term sacrifices more rewarding through goal setting helps us increase our self-awareness as well, again, where we decrease the overreactivity of the amygdala by noticing our thoughts and emotions when we get the urge to act on something. But again, we're going to cover goal setting in 2 points' time. And the last thing to mention about habit formation is procrastination. The only thing to note about procrastination is, by the way, that's a car. Don't ask me how I drew this masterpiece, but I did. The only thing to note about procrastination is procrastinating is no different from sitting in a car and just trying to turn the steering wheel. In order to make momentum, you have to press the accelerator. So you just have to do something. And last little philosophical insight about procrastination, you create more pain by procrastinating than by just facing this thing. So close the loop and just do something. When it comes to exercising, eating healthy, or sitting down to study or work, whatever habit you want to instill, just do that thing for 2 minutes, and if you want to stop, you can, but reduce the barrier to entry. Now moving on to point number 3, exercise. And I know what you're going to say, but Lewis, I don't want to exercise. Of course you don't, you're depressed, you buffoon. But all of the symptoms that depression gives us can be mitigated by exercise. For example, depression physically makes you feel lethargic. Exercise helps you feel energetic. Sleep. Depression messes up your sleep patterns. Exercise gives you restorative sleep. Your appetite is either too low or high when you're depressed, but exercise improves your appetite. Mentally, depression makes it harder to focus, but exercise helps you feel sharper and become a better planner. Mood, you're depressed, obviously. Exercise improves your mood. Lastly, socially, you feel isolated when you're depressed. However, when you're exercising, it brings you out of your shell. Now, the fitness industry is rife with steroids nowadays, but when it comes to your mental faculties, your brain already has a pretty much inbuilt steroid. Something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which literally makes your brain stronger and resistant to all kinds of problems. So when you exercise, your efforts aren't going nowhere. Just to illustrate this one point further, exercise literally makes your brain stronger, but it's like a fertilizer with a plant. You have to keep going in order to reap the rewards. Most importantly, movement increases the firing rate of your serotonin neurons. Importantly enough, serotonin stimulates the production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the natural steroids in our brain we mentioned a second ago. So exercise sets the ball in motion, but our brain's mechanisms keep the momentum going. Now, when you're depressed, you experience a lot of overthinking. And this is largely due to a lagging of your norepinephrine levels in your brain. Remember, norepinephrine helps us focus and think clearly. Now, that's why most antidepressants target norepinephrine, but a study in Germany found that exercise increases your brain's norepinephrine levels, which means if you go hard, your brain will reward you in norepinephrine, which decreases your overthinking. What's more, if you keep an exercise plan and you tick off the days when you've exercised, that releases dopamine, giving you more motivation to work out. And exercise in general increases blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. Lastly, let's cover how exercise affects sleep. Depressed people get more REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, which means their brain is more active, which means the quality of their sleep is less restful. However, exercise decreases the amount of REM sleep you have, meaning you engage in more restful sleep. So all you need to know about exercise is this. You exercise, so you sleep deeper, you feel happier, you have more energy, you're more motivated to exercise, and when you rinse and repeat, the cycle starts again, a positive flywheel. So, find a sport you love, or start working out in your garden, whatever it is that works for you. 4 more points, and now we are on to point number 4 to help us spiral upwards. Point number 4 in spiraling upwards is set goals and make decisions. The only reason why you feel indecisive at any point throughout your life is because there are multiple brain regions fighting for your brain energy. The striatum is arguing, guys, let's just do what we've always done. Prefrontal cortex is responding with, no, but we need to achieve our goals. And the nucleus accumbens is sat there saying, oh, that cookie looks nice. But when it comes to making decisions, there is one analogy that beats everything. Let's imagine you're stranded in the ocean by yourself and your face is just barely above the surface. If you stay there, just treading the water, you will drown in a matter of minutes. However, if you just make a decision and start swimming in one direction, good or bad, you're more likely to reach safety. So what this highlights is something you already know, but it's worth reminding you of. When we burden ourselves by trying to make the best decision, we just feel stressed. Because there's no way to make the best decision, no matter what decision you're making. We need to focus on making a good decision, because this gives us the feeling that we're in control. Just making a good decision, no matter what it is, decreases our anxiety and worry, and this decisiveness feeds into other areas in our life. Now, just making a decision in terms of your habits, what you're going to do today, or whether to go to that event or not, won't drastically improve your life, but they do improve your ability to spiral upwards. To give you one last analogy, if I turn all the lights off in my room, let's say I tried to search for my pen in the darkness, let's imagine it's pitch black, it's going to be incredibly difficult to do so. However, if I just turn a light on by making a decision, it doesn't guarantee I'll find the pen, but it definitely helps my ability to do so. So when in doubt, make a decision. Now moving on to goals. When we set goals, our prefrontal cortex is over the moon because it can now guide our behaviour towards this goal, and it determines what we hear, smell and pay attention to. in pursuit of that goal. It's exactly the same how Google works, because when you type in something like, why don't butt cheeks melt cheese, it gives you the most crucial answers first, instead of you having to search for the most crucial answer on page 10. The prefrontal cortex acts like a police chief, telling his other policemen only search for drug dealers or ignore speeding tickets today. But as we mentioned, when you're depressed, you're too bogged down by irrelevant things, meaning that you can't snap out of those things and think in a higher level way and set your mind towards goals. So in order to break free from all of this irrelevant noise in your mind, you need to just choose a single focus. Purge your self-awareness until you're able to find the goals that are intrinsically meaningful to you, and then set one or two of them as the focus for the remainder of your time this year, or over how much a period of time that you want to set. But don't set vague and hard to understand goals, otherwise known as nebulous goals, because so many studies show that depressed people set vague goals, which means they don't achieve them, which means they feel more depressed. So instead of setting goals such as get healthier, change it for do a 45-minute workout each day. Be as specific as you possibly can. And there's two more things when it comes to setting goals. And one, most importantly, is you need to decide for something that you want. Because usually we think happiness involves when good things happen to us, but happiness is actually when we're in pursuit of a goal that we have chosen. For example, studies have shown when you put two rats in a cage with a button in front of rat 1, which when it presses it will release cocaine for both rats, rat 2 starts to show symptoms of depression because it has no control over the reward. And interestingly enough, rat 1 releases more dopamine. So, in a human context, brilliant. I'm not sure if you can hear that, but the neighbour's kid has just decided to start jumping on the trampoline. Pursuing a job out of your own choice is much more rewarding than randomly getting offered one. Buying a cookie is better than randomly being given one, and getting out of bed by choice is much better and more motivating than waiting until you need the toilet. And lastly, wanting to do a good job is much more motivating than wanting to avoid doing a bad job. So the more control you feel over your fate and your destiny, the less depressed, less stressed, worried and anxious you will feel. But no, it's not about the actual control. Because remember what we covered earlier in that little table, some things you have absolutely no control over. It's about your level of perceived control. Let's cover the last three things. Up next, point number 5. Number 5 is your sleep hygiene and all of the things that affect your quality of sleep, such as your light, noise, sun exposure, routine and exercise. But let's cover what happens when we close our eyes and nod off for 8 hours. Now, when it comes to the actual architecture of our sleep, there are a few stages. So when we close our eyes, we enter something called stage 1, which is about 10 to 20 minutes after we close our eyes. And this is when the electrical waves in our brain really start to slow down. Stage 2 is after about 20 minutes. Then we go into stage 3 and 4, which is real slow wave sleep. And then stage 5, known as REM sleep, rapid eye movement, and this is where our brain is much more active. This whole architecture consists of about 90 minutes, and that is one sleep cycle. And just like a video game, throughout the 8 or 9 or 7 or 6 hours that we're asleep, our brain repeats these cycles. But the important thing to note is if you're woken up during this stage, stage 5 REM sleep, you are much more disturbed and likely to get that weird groggy feeling. However, when you're woken up during stage 1, about 10 to 20 minutes after you fall asleep, you're likely to feel much more restored. Your brain needs a good sleep routine to follow without drastic variation, because that feeling you get before you sleep and you're feeling all sleepy is due to a release of, remember, melatonin, which also improves the quality of your sleep. But if before you're going to bed you're scrolling or you're looking at bright lights, this is going to disrupt the release of melatonin so you don't feel as sleepy. And studies have shown that exposure to bright lights or screens between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. result in feelings of depression and inability to learn the next day. And lastly, sleep is important because when we sleep, our brain flushes out all of the toxins and clears our brain so we're fresh for the next day, and it improves the cognitive function of our prefrontal cortex. Now, to finalise this section about sleep, we're just going to cover two more things. One about the circadian rhythm, and then a practical tip on what to do when you are laying in bed and you can't shut your mind up. So you've heard of the circadian rhythm before, I'm sure, but what it does in particular is throughout the day, all of your fluctuations of your hormones such as cortisol, testosterone, estrogen and other things, and your hunger and alertness and body temperature is governed by your circadian rhythm, which in turn is governed by its exposure to light. Because there are neurons that connect your eyeballs to your hypothalamus, which resets your circadian rhythm each day. To be as practical as possible here, get early morning sunlight for 5 to 10 minutes as soon as you wake up, no matter the sun exposure in your country. And 2, turn off all bright lights around 2 hours before bed and don't use any screens. Replace them for books, candle lights or what have you. If you are going to use light in the evening, then don't use lights that are above your head because they mimic the sunlight. Put all lamps on the floor. Now moving on to conquer that annoying sensation when you can't stop your mind thinking when you're in bed. When you fall asleep and you randomly wake up, it's because you have too much activity in your prefrontal cortex and your anterior cingulate. And this is because you haven't discharged all of your irrelevant and overthinking thoughts before you went to bed. Now, the simplest ways that you can do this is journal. Keep a notepad out by your bedside, so whenever you wake up, just write down and capture without judgment everything you're thinking about. For me, as you guys know, I go on a walk before bed and I talk to myself out loud. Anything that is going to get your mind more quiet by releasing the thoughts that are inside your skull. And the only other things to note about sleep before we end is that it improves the frontal limbic connection and it improves your brain's ability to store memories. Moving on, 2 more points left. The second to last point we're going to cover is something called biofeedback, which is nothing more than our brain's ability to change based on what our body does. If you're a big fan of this channel, then you know that in reference to getting out of ruts, one of our favourite phrases is mood follows action. Also, you cannot fight the mind with the mind, you have to turn to the body. And this is what biofeedback is. And there are 4 things I'm going to suggest that you do to optimize your biofeedback. You can use any of these 4 things when you're feeling in a rut or you're feeling that overwhelming sense of depression come over you. Number 1, splash cold water on your face. This sparks something called the vagus nerve, which slows down your heart rate. Number 2, create a playlist of upbeat songs you can press shuffle on at any moment in time to give you that uplifted feeling. Number 3, smile. Now, I know you're not going to like this, but it makes sense. The only muscles you need to pay attention to in your brain when you smile are your forehead muscles and the muscles around here. The forehead muscle is called the corrugator supercilii, and then these muscles are called your zygomatic major muscles. Think about it. When you smile, you signal to your brain, oh, we're smiling, so we must be happy about something. Just something to pay attention to. Number 4, laugh. Watch comedy shows if you're feeling a bit down, or be around people who make you chuckle. There's only 2 more things we're going to quickly cover in terms of biofeedback, and the next one is about your breath, because there is a yogic saying that I love which encapsulates the power of your breath. It says the mind is the master over the body, but the breath is the master over the mind. This thing we mentioned earlier, the vagus nerve, does one thing in reference to your heart and breathing. It carries signals away or to your heart, and we can, for a lack of a better word, program the signals we send to our brain by controlling our breath. If we increase the intensity of our breath, for example, taking more inhales than we do exhales, then we are signaling excitement and we are stimulating our sympathetic nervous system. However, if we slow the rate of our breathing down by, for example, doing something called the physiological sigh, so you take 2 breaths in and a long exhale, so or the box breathing technique where you inhale for 4, hold for 4 seconds, exhale for 4 seconds. We slow our heart rate down and we get into more parasympathetic or calming activity. So if you want to be more excited, increase the intensity of your breath. Maybe do something called the breath of fire, where you go repeatedly for a minute or 2 minutes. And if you want to calm yourself down, exhale longer than you inhale. Now, the last thing we're going to cover in terms of biofeedback is something called gratitude. I want to be very careful with this topic because telling someone who feels depressed to be more grateful has the complete opposite effect. But the one thing I want to highlight is the way our brain works in terms of gratitude is it takes what it thinks and then projects it outward onto the world, which is to say, in a very simplistic sense, that if you pay attention to what you're grateful for, you're priming yourself to notice more things that you feel grateful for. But the very debilitating way people encourage us to enact gratitude is by looking at other people's misfortunes and comparing them to our own. However, this does not spark gratitude. This just sparks a feeling of guilt and shame. So the best way to increase your levels of gratitude is to 1. Write a letter of gratitude, either to yourself, to someone or something that you appreciate. And number 2, express gratitude for things yet to come. Because remember, context-dependent memory when you're depressed is going to lock you into that steady state of negativity bias where you only have access to your negative memories. However, if you start to project into the future and think about things you're excited for and you're grateful for, even though they haven't happened yet, not only do you tap into laws of the universe stuff and all of that woo-woo, but you start to engage your prefrontal cortex to think more about the future. And lastly, we are on the home straight. The last thing to mention in our sequence of spiraling upwards is the social. Now, do you remember that neurochemical we mentioned at the beginning that is responsible for our feelings of trust, love, and connectedness? No worries if not, it's oxytocin. And when you're depressed, your oxytocin levels are a bit out of whack, as are your brain circuits. For example, sometimes you release too much oxytocin, or sometimes when you're depressed, you release too little. However, there are a few things you can do to increase your levels of oxytocin. Some of them in the social context you're going to think are quite obvious. One is eye contact. It's really important that we feel a sense of presence when we're engaging with other people, and when we're engaged in a good conversation, we produce oxytocin, which gives our brain good feedback. Number 2, physical touch. We all differ in our propensities to enjoy holding hands, hugging other people or whatnot, but physical touch is incredibly important for the human being. And when you're depressed, if you're anything like me, you retreat into yourself and tend to isolate yourself more. In fact, I saw a comment on a YouTube video the other day about depression. It was on a Dr. K video and someone said, "I want to be alone, but I hate being lonely." So understand, when you're depressed, you're not going to naturally want to reach out to other people, but it's important you do so because you need both of these things in order to increase your oxytocin levels, which of course give you the feeling of connectedness, love, trust, and reduce your anxiety. Outside of the social context, you can increase your hot and cold exposure. If you have a hot bath, a sauna, or put a warm blanket over you, as well as a cold shower and things of that sort, then you're going to increase your oxytocin levels. 2 more, Or is that feeling of being in nature or seeing something that is completely out the scope of everyday life and you're just spellbounded by it. So take some time to walk in nature, not with music on or a podcast, and really revel in the bliss of nature or whatever you find interesting. Look at the bugs playing or look at the bees and just think, Jesus Christ, how is this even possible that they're living these weird little microscopic lives? And spark that feeling of awe, which sparks your serotonin. And lastly, soothing music. I would suggest listen to music around 40 hertz or 936 hertz, and that not only helps you while you're focusing with things, but it will produce a feeling of serotonin and calm you down. Now, listen, mate, a little one-to-one as we bring this social part to a close and almost finish the video. Take your socializing seriously, okay? You don't have to become an extrovert. You don't have to become suddenly Jack Sparrow and you're talking to everyone. Jack Sparrow's a bit of a weird example, but you don't have to completely break out of your shell. You just have to understand you're a human being, and if you don't meet basic needs such as eye contact, a feeling of connectedness and trust with other people, and you don't have physical touch where you hug people every now and then, you're going to fuel your depression, okay? So take your socializing seriously and think about creative ways you can meet the social needs that are unique to you. For example, you might combine exercising with your social needs by going to a sports club or reaching out to a friend once a week, and that's enough for you. Find what works for you. Okay, I'm not going to do a big summary, so I'm just going to leave the points on the board as I leave you with one final message. There we go, a cheeky little summary there. Listen, mate, one last thing. If you do all of these things over a period of a few weeks or a few months and you really give it your all, but you still feel depressed, then it's time to seek professional help, okay? And that there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're a complete failure. It means you're strong enough to admit you need help from other people, okay? Take your mental health seriously. And I just hope you've learned some things in this video which will enable you to do so. If you have watched this whole video, you have my utmost respect, honestly. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate your time and attention. So, no more rambling. Mood follows action. And just take your mental health seriously, okay? Stay disciplined, stay playful, stay dangerous. Adios, muchachos y muchachas.